From an Oscar-winning film which captured the essence of an era to pictures made in his garage with a cast of amateurs, the output of director Ken Russell, who's died aged 84, varied hugely in quality but was never bland. Today, friends and former colleagues paid tribute to a man described as flamboyant, visionary, who was, as we're about to see, always prepared to push the boundaries. Our culture editor, Matthew Kane, has this report.
It was scenes like this which earned Ken Russell notoriety in the late 60s and 70s.
Naked men, weren't seen wrestling in films in 1965.
That was way ahead of its time, wasn't it? To get that through into
some countries now, they have women wrestling in mud and all that, don't they?
I don't know. I haven't been to those countries. Where are they?
Born in Southampton in 1927, Ken Russell worked as a merchant seaman and then a dancer before joining the BBC's arts department. He went on to direct 32 documentaries, including this celebrated film on Elgar, the first documentary to use dramatisations. He then broke into cinema with Women in Love. An international success, it earned him an Oscar nomination for Best Director, while its star Glenda Jackson won Best Actress. A string of hits followed, all of them very different to the kitchen sink realism of the 50s and 60s.
What Ken Russell's films of the 1970s are famous for is unleashing the visionary imagination in British film. There was a certain kind of greyness, perhaps, to British social realism that came before Ken Russell.
Some of his biggest hits included Tommy, a rock opera starring The Who, and the musical The Boyfriend starring Twiggy. But he's perhaps best remembered for his controversial work. The Devils had to be heavily edited because of its scenes of graphic sex and violence, including one sequence in which sex-crazed nuns assault a statue of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, he upset people, but that was part of his extravagance, his madness, and, he was brave, he was never boring. I mean, Ken always said to me, I don't care if people love or hate my films, as long as they just don't go off and make a cup of tea in the middle.
Ken Russell revelled in his reputation as a colourful eccentric. But towards the end of his career, when his style of filmmaking fell out of fashion, his personality began to overwhelm the work itself. And his flamboyance, which had been his greatest strength, became his greatest enemy. Later films like The Fall of the Louse of Usher had low production values and earned the derision of the critics. And he made this memorable appearance on Celebrity Big Brother in 2007. For many, Ken Russell's flamboyance undermined our understanding of his contribution to British cinema, and he didn't receive the recognition he deserved.
And that's all, folks. Bye!
Well, I think Ken will be remembered as a nutter. That's very good, we need nutters in the movie industry. We don't want people who look like bank clerks or, Ken was a nutter. And he did what he wanted, while he was allowed to.
Ken Russell died in hospital yesterday after a series of strokes. Glenda Jackson, the star of Women in Love, told us he was a genius. To work with him was a unique and wonderful experience. He was warm, loving, and intensely and passionately human.
Well, joining us now is the film director and producer Don Boyd, who was a friend and collaborator of Ken Russell's. It was a varied oeuvre, wasn't it?
Very varied, but that's what made it so fascinating and exciting to watch.
It started with music. Was music a passion?
A complete passion. He was the only man I know that could listen to 4 versions of a symphony and know the differences between them in the way they were recorded and conducted. And he could quote them specifically, bar by bar. Amazing.
He went for a cascade of composers. Elgar, Delius?
His film about Delius was his favourite film. They were usually quirky characters. His film about Strauss, Richard Strauss, was controversial in the extreme because it dealt with the whole business about anti-Semitism linked in with Strauss's music.
But that, in a way, is the oddity, isn't it? He would pick away at a character and find something really quite odd about him and then go for it.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Ken is that I don't really think he was a traditional nutter. He was actually a highly intelligent man who would like to find something that would absorb people that they hadn't thought of. And he'd like to confront in that way. And some of his more moving sequences are as moving as anything that's been produced in cinema, quite apart from the mad ones like The Devils.
But then, moving off the sort of high intellectual territory onto what is still intellectual, Women in Love, but was a sexy film, let's face it. Even in the 60s, it was romping around in the nude in front of the fireplace was quite something.
Well, it's quite interesting. I think Ken benefited from the revolution that occurred during the 60s. And in a way, he was able to be flamboyant about a classic, which had been one of the canon of Lawrence's work that caused all the controversy with Lady Chatterley's Lover. So Ken thought, right, I've got to match that.
But we might have found them absolutely fantastic in the 60s, but won't it be for this generation a bit like us watching films from the 20s?
Not at all. I mean, for instance, the section he made in my film Aria, which is a beautiful cinematic rendition of Nessun Dorma, which became the World Cup football piece of music, is so clever and so brilliant that people on YouTube now use those images and put their own music to it because the images are almost more powerful than the music itself. That's genius.
What about the stuff in the garden shed at the end? I mean, was that... perhaps Michael Winner... Well, no mean nutter himself. I mean, that's not a libel, by the way. But I mean...
we're all nutters.
What about the stuff in the garden shed?
Well, I think that's a form of very sweet, sort of desperate need to cling on to his art form. When you're out of favour, nobody's giving you any money to make bigger movies, you think, what can I do? I know, 8mm cameras, video cameras, and let's involve people in stuff there. And so it happens at the back in the back garden in a shed.
And in a word, where do you place him in the kind of pantheon of great British film directors?
I don't think he's just great British film director. He's a great world film director, and he's in the same pantheon as people like Kubrick, the whole bunch, Fellini, Antonioni. Ken was a genius.
Don Boyd, thank you very much indeed for joining us.